Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the April 2026 meeting of the Houston Archaeological Society. My name's Bob Sewell, and I'm president of the society. And this evening, I'd like to welcome Bethany Miller, who is an anthropology master's student at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico, focusing on archaeology and cultural resource management. Bethany received her Bachelor of Science in Anthropology with a minor in Native American Studies and a certificate in Museum Studies from Utah State University in May of 2024. Since then, she's worked contract archaeology during the summers and participated in 2 field schools in Belize, most recently in the capacity as crew lead. Bethany will be presenting her thesis research on the 2026 at the 2026 Society for American Archaeology annual meeting poster session later this month. She will graduate with her master's degree in May, after which she hopes to continue doing field and laboratory work in archaeology full-time, potentially continuing onto a doctoral program in the future. Bethany's presentation this evening will discuss the Fremont culture, which occupied the transition zone between the Colorado Plateau and Great Basin about 100 to 1300 CE. So, without further ado, please welcome Bethany Miller. Over to you, Bethany.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction for sure. So the title of my thesis is Fremont Standardization and Specialization, and I did this through a case study of emery painted bowls. But before I get too much into my thesis research, I'm just going to give you an overview of Fremont archaeology, since I'm assuming most people aren't very familiar with it, being so far away from Houston. So who are the Fremont? They were agriculturalists on the northern periphery of the American Southwest from 100 to about 1300 CE. This map shows the approximate Fremont culture area, which roughly is the state of Utah, with most of the sites kind of following this mountain range that marks the transition between the two areas. And you can see it kind of bleeds into Nevada and Colorado, but mostly is contained in the state of Utah. So early researchers in the Fremont area, Neil Judd and Neil Morris, noted a clear connection with the rest of the Southwest. So some of the first excavations in the 1920s and 30s were in the Fremont River drainage, which is how the Fremont got their name, and that river drainage is named after John C. Fremont. So it's not what they would have called themselves, but for lack of a better term, it's what we use. The Fremont clearly had connections with the Southwest. Again, the early researchers made note. Noel Morris said, so far as can be evaluated, the influences which molded Fremont culture appear to have been Southwestern. Other researchers, though, for a period of time disagreed with this Southwestern Northern periphery statement. And researchers like Jesse Jennings called it its own desert culture instead. And this led to a period of time in Fremont research where it was being interpreted more like a hunting and gathering community that dabbled in agriculture, which kind of meant that most of the other aspects of material culture that agriculturalists have, like ceramics, really were understudied. So that's kind of why Fremont ceramics is kind of having its moment right now. But you can see on this map on the, I guess I don't know if it's the right or left for you guys, but the right for me, that the archaeologists in the Southwest really don't include Fremont on their maps. So this is a map made by the Fremont archaeologists, and we put Fremont on there, but the rest of the Southwest kind of ignores Fremont archaeology for the most part, which is, I think, kind of funny. But just to give you kind of, orient you in time, this is the chronology for the Fremont region. Again, this is kind of debated when Fremont starts versus when it, depends on kind of what you define as Fremont. since I define Fremont as agriculturalists, and most archaeologists do as well, Fremont archaeologists today do, we mark the start of Fremont at 100 CE with the earliest dated corn in the region. And the middle Fremont period is really marked by the introduction of plainware pottery, and we start to get kind of hamlet-sized settlements in the area. And then something kind of crazy happens around 1000 CE, and we get this huge spike in population and an aggregation into these large Fremont villages. And this is very strange for the area, and we also start to see stuff like surface adobe structures and painted pottery. So this is where I hang out, is the late Fremont period. And the kind of running theory for what happened is a migration from other southwestern groups into the Fremont region, as opposed to just natural population growth, because it seems unlikely that they were able to get so big so fast without some migration. So that's kind of our broad chronology. And just to give you an idea of a Fremont village, this is the site map for Five Finger Ridge. It is in central Utah, and it's a very classic late Fremont village. We have all the classic elements. So the Fremont lived in pit houses through the entire occupation from 100 to 1300, strictly living in pit houses. So you have those kind of all around here. And then you get these rectangular surface adobe structures you can see here, which are most likely for storage. And then you get communal spaces, and you can see that at the top of the ridge here. There are two large squares. Those would be large ramada type structures. And then there's a clearing here, which is an activity area or a plaza. And then they would have been farming down in by this river here. So most of the Fremont villages are located near rivers, and they would have used floodplain kind of farming techniques for that. These are just some photos so you can kind of better visualize the villages. So this is a typical Fremont pit house, more square in shape, central hearth with a vent shaft. They're semi-subterranean, so not completely underground, not above ground though. This is an example of a surface adobe structure for communal storage, and this is an artist reconstruction of what those kind of ramada communal spaces would have looked like. One other interesting thing about Fremont archaeology is or architecture, is we also see kind of unusual residences pop up in this late Fremont period, which are larger pit houses that are not communal sized, but bigger than single household. And they usually have very interesting kind of luxury goods from far away. And we also see a lot more complexity inside those structures. So we're starting to see kind of some social stratification in this later Fremont period with those unusual structures. So what did they eat? They were agriculturalists. They did mostly, especially in the late period, invest very heavily in maize agriculture. They also grew other things like beans and squash, which all would have been traded up from the Southwest at some point. The Fremont did actually have their own variety of maize, which was better adapted to the colder, higher elevation climate of Utah and the shorter growing seasons that are up there. And at about 1000 CE, we get the medieval warm period happening. And so this agricultural niche pops up right along this corridor between the two, the plateau and the Great Basin. We get this nice corridor where all the Fremont, like large villages, are located that is just perfect for maize agriculture. So we think that's why they started investing even more and aggregating into larger villages to do agriculture, because it just was really well with the climate there. And then at about 1300, that's the kind of end of the medieval warm period, and we see the Fremont pretty much abandon the areas. They leave their large villages, and it seems like they depopulate the area pretty well. And we don't entirely know exactly where they went. There's not a NAGPRA designated descendancy line either, so we're not 100% sure yet on that, but the kind of running theory is that they kind of dissipated into surrounding culture groups, either returning to other groups in the Southwest, going into the plains, or possibly just returning to a hunting and gathering or more foraging heavy subsistence strategy. So not as much, not very many people after about 1300 in that area. So just some classic Fremont art, material culture for you here. Fremont rock art is very distinctive. It's got a lot of anthropomorphic figures that are trapezoidal in shape, and they usually have ornate headdresses and lots of necklaces or other ornamentation on them. We also see a lot of faunal kind of depictions, usually bighorn sheep or deer. We also get a lot of more abstract designs in the rock imagery, stuff like spirals and other kind of patterns, which is also interesting. And then the Fremont also make these kind of adorable little Fremont figurines, and they're made from unfired clay. So usually we only find them in pit houses that have been burned down. And they also have ornamentation, and sometimes they're decorated with pigments, and they're actually usually found in pairs that seem to resemble male-female. So we're thinking that's kind of an interesting thing. There's not as many studies done on those yet, though, so we're hoping that gets cleared up in the future. And then another kind of interesting thing about the Fremont is their shoes. They have moccasins, which for the Southwest, that's very unusual. Everybody else is wearing sandals, and they have these very lovely moccasins. And they are even unique among moccasins because they include the dew claw of the animal on the moccasin, which, again, the purpose is unknown, but it's very interesting and very unique. Fremont have baskets like many other Southwestern cultures. They have their own unique designs. Not my specialty, though. And then gaming pieces. We find a lot of bone or ceramic gaming pieces in Fremont pit houses as well. So it is something, classically Fremont. Where we also see something interesting is we do see trade into the region. So we get turquoise from Nevada and Arizona coming in, and we also get shells from coastline settlements, and we also get intrusive obsidian. So there are volcanic eruptions in the Fremont region, so they have obsidian, but we are getting intrusive types of obsidian into the region. And most of these luxury goods seem pretty evenly distributed, although more of them are found in those unusual residences and found in special burials than your average pit house. But there are clear connections and trade and interaction with the rest of the Southwest as well. Where my specialty is more is Fremont ceramics. So this is where my research is under the umbrella of Fremont ceramics. And so all Fremont ceramics are graywares, and they are made in the coil and scrape method, which is you roll your ceramics into a coil. You use a little pookie, which is such a fun name for it, but it's a little pre-made form to help you form the bottom of your base. And then you roll it up and you smooth as you go. And overall, Fremont pottery is very highly smooth. Like you can see on this jar here, very smooth, it's shiny even, very highly polished. Fremont plainwares are all locally made, so they all have distinct temper types and distinct clay sources, and they're all used at a household or communal level, and that's about it. And they come in jars, bowls, and pitchers for the most part. So we have some examples here. Most of the jars have some form of applique or corrugation or incised patterns. One of the more unique ones is called coffee bean applique. You can see in this top right picture. It actually looks a lot more like corn kernels than coffee beans, but it's called coffee bean applique. It's one of those funny things. But where my study is under is actually the painted wares. And so there's two examples of the painted bowls here. Painted wares are almost exclusively bowls in the Fremont region. It is very, very rare to find a Fremont painted jar or anything else. So almost exclusively bowls. And the kind of interesting thing about it, what kind of piqued my interest, was that Fremont painted wares are made for the most part in two areas, but they're distributed across the Fremont region. So this is, I mean, you don't have to read this whole flow chart, but it's how we type Fremont ceramics. So they're all graywares, and then we type it by region and then by surface finish. So corrugation, plain, or painted. And then it's by temper type. So again, each region, which is on the map here, Great Salt Lake, Sevier, Snake Valley, Emory, and Uinta, all have their own distinct temper types and clay that they use, but they all fire to that gray color, which means they're being fired in a reducing atmosphere, so a closed kiln system, which is a technological advancement that's really interesting and not shared among a lot of other cultures. But the painted wares are being produced in Snake Valley area, which the main sites are Paraguna, Parowan, and Evans Mound. And this area is producing Snake Valley black on gray. And that ends up distributed across the region as well. And then where my research is, which is in red, is the Emory region. And that produces two different types, Ivy Creek black on white and Emory black on gray. But in both cases, they come from these regions and then they end up all over. And so the kind of question here is, what piques my interest is, why would you do that? Every region knows how to make their own pottery. Why are they trading so far? And we know that they were trading or getting them from these regions. A dissertation in 2022, done by actually my chair for my thesis down here, used neuron activation analysis to show that wherever these bowls ended up, their clay sources could be chemically traced back to the clay sources for these two production zones. So these are the emery painted bowls that I'm looking at. I think they're very beautiful. They're very, very ornately decorated bowls. So Ivy Creek black on white is slipped, which is with a white slip, and Emory black on gray is unslipped. And you pretty much can't tell the difference between the slipped and unslipped from a photograph like this because they are so consistent with their coloring, with their firing process, that even the gray ones that are unslipped are actually a really light color. So they're not a dark gray. They're going to be pretty light anyways. But in both cases, they kind of fall under this umbrella of emery painted wares produced in about the same area. So my sample for my study, I decided to pick two sites from inside the production zone, so Snake Rock Village and Round Spring, and four sites from outside the production zone. So I had Five Finger Ridge, Baker's Village, Snow Farm, and Woodard Mound. And they are all sites with high concentrations of emery painted wares, so I'd have a big enough sample for my study. And again, they're being produced in that area, but traded out to the rest of the region. So the way that I kind of wanted to look at this was through the lens of if the emery production zone qualified as a specialized crafting community, and then what that would tell us about the Fremont identity on large, and the possible importance of these bowls, why people would travel hundreds of miles over really rough terrain, like it's mountain ranges and marshes, like it's not fun, I'm sure, to travel that far on foot. So really trying to understand that. And the way that I did this was to look at the level of standardization in the emery painted bowls in the final products. So where they ended up. So standardization, just to give you a quick definition, is really just how similar things are to each other. So more standardized pottery will be very similar to each other, and less standardized pottery will be more different, more variation in your sample. So the first thing I looked at here was mechanical standardization. And this is really representing the unconscious decisions that a potter would make about bowl form. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of practice theory because I feel like that can get really complicated really fast. But basically, if I asked everybody here to draw me or find me a cereal bowl, all of you would probably grab or draw about the same sized and shaped bowl, right? We all have an understanding of that. If somebody showed up to our cereal brunch with a salad bowl, we'd all know that they were being silly and they didn't bring the right kind of bowl. So the mechanical aspect of it is, do you have the right size and shape for the bowl that you're trying to make? And very largely in my sample of emery painted wares, we see that that's the case, that there seems to be an ideal form that they are following. My lip forms, I mostly saw flat and rounded lips, which actually tend to be almost the same thing because they're like, they just go from like this to this to this to this. And so it's pretty much the same lip form across the ceramics. Rim diameter, rim thickness, wall thickness, all those kind of morphological aspects of the bowl are all very standardized. We have a very clear, you can see in this bar graph, a very clear peak, a very clear average, and then pretty minimal variation in the sample on whole. The only one that kind of threw me off for a minute was actually rim diameter, where you can see I have a bimodal distribution. I have two peaks here, one at 20 centimeters and one at 25 centimeters. And at first that threw me off, and I did some more research, and it looks like that is likely because they were stacking the bowls. So that size difference is just enough where you could have stacked the bowls inside each other, making them easier for transport or storage. So that's probably why I had a little more variation in rim diameters than the other things. But overall, pretty much all the same size and shape. Um, the second thing that I kind of looked at here was the non-mechanical standardization. So these are the conscious decisions that potters and consumers would have been making about these bowls. So if we think back to our cereal bowls, although we'd all grab very similarly sized bowls, the color of them, if they have designs on them, would all be more reflective of our personality and our personal identity than not. So this is kind of where we're getting at here, is looking at the designs to see if there's any designs that really stand out. And essentially all I saw here was there was standardization. They seem to follow these design parameters. So the typical layout painted bowl is going to have a rim framing line, a line below that, a bottom framing line, and a parallel line to that. And the rest of the designs will be contained between those two lines. And the more common elements are going to be triangles, dots, spirals, that kind of thing. This image here has pretty much the standard kind of what I'd see on a bowl. And then the other aspect of this is luster. So something I noticed when I was starting to analyze these was just how shiny they are. For ceramics with no glaze on them, these are incredibly shiny. So shiny that I could capture it with a regular camera with just a little bit of extra light. You can see it in the photo, maybe, depending on how blurry it is for you. And so it seems to be a design choice to make these bowls highly polished, more polished than any other Fremont ceramics that I've seen. So it seems to be a conscious decision that both the potters and the people getting the bowls want really shiny bowls. So just, showing that there is standardization in what they are thinking about for what they want out of these bowls when they're trading for them or making them. The next kind of last bit of standardization that I looked at was in the production and the intended use of these bowls. So the first thing I did was an oxidation analysis. So I refired some nips off of these ceramics. And this really showed that they're using two main clay sources. So one that refires to a light or almost white color. So it had almost no naturally occurring iron in the clay. And then a reddish and yellow color, so that one does. And it seems regardless of which clay source they used, they were able to initially fire it to a very light gray color, which just shows a level of standardization in the firing process and a level of just technical specialization to get your bowls so consistently the same color, kind of regardless of if you're using a clay source with iron or not, is pretty impressive. The second aspect, so the intended use of the bowls for this, I did a volumetric porosity test. So really just seeing how much water the sherds would absorb in a set amount of time. And doing this to figure out, what are the possible uses that these bowls could have served. And I compared it to, I also did this with some planewares from every site, so I'd have a good baseline for this. And it looks like the emery painted bowls are consistently having lower porosity scores than both the Fremont planewares and other Southwestern ceramics. So this just indicates that they're going to have less thermal resistance to heat. Like if you heat them up, they're going to probably shatter. And they're also going to be less permeable to water. So this just means that the bowls were probably never used for cooking, because if you put them over the fire, they probably wouldn't do too well. And they were probably serving bowls. So it just gives you kind of a more narrow range of possible uses for what they could have been using the bowls for. Obviously, in the future, I'd love to do other stuff to maybe, figure out a little bit more about what they were using them for, but it was a good starting point. So once I had figured out that the bowls were in fact standardized and it seemed like they had an ideal form in mind, then I had to, go into my overall question, which, if they are made by craft specialists. And we kind of define craft specialist as if they are being produced at a level that surpasses the household needs, with the intent of trading them out or giving them away for some reason. And I was using Costin's 4 parameters for specialization, which have been used by a lot of other ceramicists. So a good standard to go off of. So the first two, I was actually able to address the first two parameters with previous research. So I didn't have to do anything for these really. The first one is context. So who are the target customers, basically, consumers of these bowls? And it just seems like the average Fremont person. So we find these at the household level and the community level inside Fremont villages. But we really don't find them outside. They're not getting traded to the ancestral pueblo, really. They're staying inside the Fremont region. But if you excavated the average late Fremont village pit house, you could probably have a good chance at finding one of these. So it just seems to be any Fremont person could have potentially had one. And then concentration is the spatial distribution, which then the map on the right shows. This is just the distribution of them across the Fremont region, and you can really see that they're concentrated around that production zone a little bit more than anywhere else, but along that corridor where most of the big sites are, you can see more concentration at the big sites. This isn't a complete spatial distribution map, as it really only covers the major Fremont village sites, but for the most part, you can tell that it is making its way across most of the Fremont region. The last two parameters for craft specialization is really where my study sits. So the first one, scale. This is just evidence for intensive production. And the way that I looked at this was just going over the old site reports and looking at the geological resources in the area. And I was able to determine that the production zone sites, so Round Spring and Snake Rock Village for me, had more pottery production debris than the non-production zone sites. So they had a greater capacity to be producing these ceramics. And then they were also in really close proximity to all of the raw materials that they would have needed to produce these bowls at a large scale. So it would have been more convenient for them to get clay, get temper, that kind of thing. And then the last one, that's really where the the standardization measures come in. So specialized communities will produce a more standardized final product. So the more standardized it is, the more specialized it is. For this, I was using, there's kind of this like golden number of 10% coefficient of variation that you want in your sample. And pretty much all of my measures were within 5-ish degrees of that. So, or 5 percentage points of that. So my wall thickness, everything like that for all the vessels was about like 11 to 20 coefficient of variation. And the kind of high end of that, like when it's no longer considered specialized, is about 50% coefficient of variation. So I'm definitely closer to that specialized form. So my results show that it was a rather highly specialized potting community, at least in comparison to other Southwestern potting communities as well. So kind of to get to like the really broad, like what do we do with this data? How do we apply it to Fremont identity? I was really trying to look at what we could learn about the importance or significance of these bowls, and then how it really relates to Fremont identity, since it does seem to be pretty distinctly like a distinctly Fremont artifact. So the first is kind of as this identity signal. So my standardization measures established that there is a shared understanding of this ideal form for what emery painted bowls should be, that they kind of fall within design parameters. There's, these are just images of the typical kinds of things I'd find on them. And though there's a decent amount of variation, they're still standardized, they're still falling within the parameters. So this just indicates a shared culture group, right? They have a shared idea of what they want these bowls to be. And then the presence of the Fremont bowls in the region, but not outside the region, can also serve as a way to interpret an identity signal where they're saying, I belong to this group versus not this group. They're distinguishing themselves from the rest of the Southwest. The same way, symbols and brands and logos do today, right? If you walk into a meeting with a Rolex or a Star Wars shirt or a Holy Cross necklace, those are going to say things about you. Those symbols, those designs, they say things about you. about what identity groups you belong to. And so potentially this is serving as a signal of identity to say, I'm part of this Fremont group. That's why I want this bull from this place. And that's why they're not traded outside of the region, is because they're for Fremont, not for anyone else. Just, possibility. Identity is a little bit harder to get at with archaeology, but this is kind of what I think my data could tell about it. Um, and the last little bit is the possible significance of these bowls. So what I was kind of looking at here was surface deposits and modification. So about half of my sample had surface deposits, and most of them were ochre and some of them were carbon. For the most part, I was actually, when I was selecting my sample from museums, I was actually trying to avoid any surface deposits or modified sherds. Since I was doing destructive analysis, I really didn't want to mess with those as much, but I still ended up with half my sample being having deposits on them, and I still ended up with 14 modified sherds. So this, to me, at least just indicates a level of value in these bowls past their utility. And then the surface deposits connects back to for the 2025 SAAs in Denver, me and my chair, Dr. Richards, did a study on ritual closure in the Fremont region. And we noted that these painted bowls are very common in ritually burned down structures or in funerary contexts. And so it seems like, covering them in ochre, either before breaking the bowls or this sherd, particularly up in the corner, has ochre not just on the back and the front, but also on the cracks. So it seems to have been covered in ochre after being broken, which is interesting. But they seem to be also found consistently in ritual contexts or possible ritual contexts. So again, just highlighting that these are significant to the Fremont in some way that passed their utility as a serving bowl. And then sorry, that was a lot to throw at you really fast. I tend to talk kind of faster when I'm nervous, so I'm sorry. But just my conclusion for this, what I found from my study is that emery painted bowls are likely produced in a specialized potting community, and they follow an ideal form that both the potters and the consumers are understanding, and that this bowl had some significant meaning within the Fremont region and was possibly related to a way to signal in-group belonging and distinction from the rest of the Southwest. So I guess at this point I will take questions if anyone has any. And this image down here is just any really cute little bighorn sheep that I found in my sample.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Bethany. That was fascinating. Does anybody have any questions for Bethany? From
Bethany,
Dan Massey. Here we go. You want to read that one out, Frank? Can you see it?
yeah. This is from Dan Massey. The Fremont pottery. Whoops. I dropped it. Hold on one second here. The
I've got it.
Fremont pottery wasn't traded out of the region, but was other pottery traded into the region?
Okay, let me go back to the map here. Sorry, this is gonna be a minute. Okay,
That's fine.
so we don't see very much intrusive pottery types, except right on this area right here, kind of the Kayenta Fremont border region. Strangely, the closest in proximity to the Southwest is actually this Paraguna sites down here, and they're very close to the Virgin ancestral Pueblo sites. But we basically don't see very much interaction between them at all. So I don't exactly know what's going on there. But it's very little overall, and it doesn't really get into deep Fremont territory. But in this border region, we do see ancestral Pueblo ceramics. I think the most interesting site that comes up is Coombs Village right here. It's actually a site where we have Fremont peoples and Kayenta ancestral Pueblo peoples living contemporarily in the same site, in the same village, but maintaining their distinct culture groups. So the Fremont in that Coombs Village, live in pit houses, use their own pottery pretty much exclusively. And the Pueblo in that site live in surface adobe structures and use their pottery almost exclusively. And so it seems even in the border region, they're really trying to maintain a distinction of some kind. It bleeds in and out a little bit, but very, very little intrusive types make it into the Fremont region.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's a question from Betsy Wittenmeyer. What were some findings in your research that you found most interesting and perhaps surprising?
I think the most interesting thing, which, after analyzing it, I probably shouldn't have been as surprised, was that I actually found more variation in my sample from the production zone sites. So my sample from Round Spring and Snake Rock Village had more variation in design and form. And at first I was very surprised at that. I was like, oh, that seems odd. But I read a lot of like Patty Crown's work and stuff, and it seems like that's actually indicative of a specialized potting community because that's showing the process of learning and apprenticeship where people in this potting community are maybe making practice bowls or bowls that don't look exactly right. And so they're not making it out of the production zone, but they're staying there. And you also see crafters inside specialized potting communities tend to experiment a little more with their designs, but the people who want the bowls from further away really don't want those experimental bowls. They just want the standardized ones. So I was surprised by that. I probably shouldn't have been, but I really was. Very interesting.
Okay, and Betsy also, excuse me, followed up with your work is very interesting and thorough. Well done. What conclusions have you reached that you feel particularly add to this field of study?
I think that addressing the broader concept of Fremont identity is pretty important to Fremont archaeology research. Although most current Fremont archaeologists kind of agree about Fremont being the northern periphery of the Southwest, there's still a lot of discourse going on of even if Fremont should be considered a cohesive culture group, just because there is regional variation. So, Great Salt Lake Fremont is a little bit more different, than Severe Fremont and stuff. But overall, even with the regional variation, the Fremont regions are more similar to each other than they are to any other culture group. So I think contributing to that idea that they seem to at least know each other and be on good terms with each other and share material culture very closely, I think that that'll be probably one of the more important things that I concluded.
Do
I got a
they have?
question.
Yeah,
Hi,
go ahead,
Bethany.
Jeff.
I've got a question. Uh, was there a culture in this part of Utah before the Fremont? And if so, what sort of pottery did they have?
So before the Fremont, we don't really see pottery. Um, that's kind of the marker of the middle Fremont period. And depending on who you talk to, that's the marker of the Fremont period. So some people don't consider Fremont starting until about 600 CE when that pottery comes in. Before the Fremont, it was, kind of that classic archaic hunter-gatherer, Great Basin kind of lifestyle.
Okay,
That
that makes
kind of stuff.
sense. Okay,
Yeah.
well, thank you. A good talk.
Bethany, do they have any idea how large the Fremont culture was? Anybody ever throw a number at it?
Um, I don't think I've ever seen a number, but sites like Five Finger Ridge have population estimates well, I don't know about Five Finger Ridge, but some of the larger Fremont sites, and Five Finger Ridge is in there, have population estimates in the hundreds. So I would maybe guess across the region, maybe 1,000 people
Yeah,
around
that's what I
there.
was wondering also. Yeah, if it was
Yeah.
about that size. So, we have another question here from Dan Massey. Could the burnishing and shine on the pottery have had a functional purpose as opposed to a decorative purpose, like for different usage?
Mhm. So yes, polishing a bowl would make it less permeable to liquids. So if you were using this to hold water, then polishing it would make a lot of sense. There's not really a reason you'd put water in a bowl that we know of. because usually you'd use pitchers for that. But yes, it would make it in a utilitarian kind of mindset, it would make it less permeable to water. So it is possible that that's why they were doing it. Mostly I note it as a stylistic choice because the other Fremont pottery, painted pottery type is not as polished. So um, the Snake Valley pottery type is not very shiny at all. In fact, it kind of has more of a sparkle to it because the temper is has mica in it, so it's got this more glittery look to it than shiny. So it seems to be a stylistic choice rather than a functional one, but I couldn't say for sure.
When they were polishing it, do you know if they were using like a glaze, like a yucca plant or something like that to rub it in? And do we have any
Not
idea
that,
on that?
yeah, not that we have noticed. There hasn't really been a ton of Fremont ceramic studies, so I'm sure somebody will do that in the future and hopefully give more insight, but right now we don't think they're using any glazes. We do find a lot of like polishing stones in these pottery production contexts. So we think they're just using like river stones that are highly smoothed to kind of keep it very smooth. And obviously on the slipped vessels, it would be a little easier to get that polish, but either way, it's probably more of an elbow grease situation.
Right.
I have a
Well,
question. So,
could the glaze be put on by an oil or a wax or something like that that may have lasted 1,000 years?
Probably not. Those tend to fall off of vessels pretty fast, especially
Yeah.
in um, more erosive environments, which a lot of these village sites in my sample is are from like arroyo contexts. So
Okay.
I'm wondering about the time course of this. So how long do you think they were making the pottery? Over hundreds of years?
So we have a range from about 1,000 to 1,300 CE is the range for painted pottery. So it's only about a 300-year time span. The interesting thing, though, is that during this time span, we don't really see a lot of changes in what they're making. So it's 300 years of pretty consistent designs, which is also pretty interesting.
Yeah. So you think so? So that was like I was thinking about that. So you have this production pottery going on for 300 years. Obviously, they're training their students over and over and over, generation after generation. Is it possible that maybe they made the pottery for a brief burst period of time over maybe 50 years, and that's all it did, and then it was distributed and just sort of maintained for the rest of the time period, or do you think they were consistently making it over that time period?
I think they were consistently making it through that time, so we do have them in different contexts. One of the things with Fremont ritual closures is that they tend to build their pit houses on top of other pit houses, and they burn down the pit house underneath and then build a new one on top. And so we do have contexts in these large villages where they're burning down a pit house with the painted ware on top of it, and then there's another pit house built on top that also has plain or painted ware pottery. So it does seem to be at least apparent through time. Um, as far as production time periods go, it was probably not a full-time gig. Like they probably were still mostly farmers. This is just probably craft specialists seasonally. From ethnographic research in the Southwest, it seems that crafting communities like this would have been mostly women doing it seasonally in like the off season for harvesting. And then it gets distributed. So they're not probably making these pots year round every year, but they are making them, I think, consistently through the 300 years they're being produced.
Great talk. Thanks.
Were there any differences in the crops that one area was raising than another? Uh, Maybe the pots got distributed because they were actually carrying something from one area to another area, uh, just transporting stuff in them, and that's they didn't just move empty pots. They moved the pots because they were carrying something from one area to another, or were the crops in the areas all pretty much the same?
So the crops in the areas would have been pretty much the same. There's evidence for agricultural fields, usually again that kind of floodplain farming, so it's a little harder to detect, but it seems like they're all growing their own crops. It is still possible that they were transporting something inside the bowls. That's outside the scope of my study. Again, something I hope people do in the future is something like starch grain analysis or something like that to really see if they were holding, because they could have been transporting maybe more luxury goods, something that's harder to detect in the record, something like amaranth or something that doesn't preserve as well. So it's possible.
There's a comment here from Betsy. There is a technique even today of burnishing pottery with a smooth stone, which is very effective, I think, at the leather hard stage prior to firing, is what she said. There's another question here from Jeff. Have the pots been found as part of grave goods?
Yes, we do find them in burial contexts as well. Kind of an interesting thing in those burial contexts, we actually either find them like by the head area or by the pelvis area of the individuals. Again, I have no idea what that would mean, but it's just interesting. They do consistently seem to be found in those contexts. We also find miniature versions of jars and bowls in the Fremont region that are buried in vent shafts, which also tend to accompany infant burials. So again, interesting. Not a ton of research done on it, so I can't say anything for sure, but definitely interesting.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they want to add or ask? Okay, that looks like the end of the questions, Bob. It's on
Jeff's
you.
asking on the chat, have the pots been found as part of grave goods?
She
Well,
just
you've
answered that. She
Okay.
just answered that.
Sorry, I missed that one. Good. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, folks, Bethany, that's fascinating presentation. I hope that your master's degree goes well and you get it in next month, which you will, of course. Congratulations. Maybe we'll see you again when you have your master's degree and or maybe your doctorate, and you can talk to us again about some more interesting stuff. So,
yeah, by the way, Bethany is graduating in a few weeks, and she already has an archaeology job out in California lined up.
so you can talk to us about
good for her.
Californian archaeology next time. So with that, I would wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bethany. Say hi to everybody for us.
Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Take care. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good night, guys. Let me turn this off.